So just to review the timeline, we had Abraham's time, and then 400 years of what? Anybody remember? After Abraham, there was
Egypt.
Yes. Egypt, and then who led them out of Egypt? Right. Moses. And then there was a 400-year period of what kind of government? Yes. Judges. Moses was the first judge, and who was the last judge? Yes. I think I'm writing too big. I'm going to run out of space here. And then 400 years of what type of government? Yes, divided monarchy. And Isaiah was right here. He lived through the fall of the north. And then what traumatic event ended the monarchy? Yes, we call that exile or captivity. Roughly 70 years, give or take. Well, more like give. And then there was a time period of returning, the post-exile, and then the time of Jesus. So, but in order to fit, we'll have the time of Jesus, and then the second coming, the end. I don't know. End times. I'll just put end. New heaven, new earth. So Isaiah's book is about 5 different time periods. Some of it refers to during his day. Some of it refers to the exile. Some of it refers to the return. Some of it refers to Christ's first coming, Messiah's first coming, and some to the end times. And that is going to be a major focus of today. So, let me pass out the notes. Should have done that.
Did you put the chapters last week?
Yes, but not on hand at the moment. Okay. So we're still going through 1 through 12 one last time because we didn't finish up the notes last time, so I expanded the New Jerusalem lesson. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that, and I think that will help. Let's look at this outline that I made of the chapters we've covered plus 13 through 27. So, chapters 1 through 5, Jerusalem is really what do you think goes there? Is very,
Sinful?
yes, wicked or evil or sinful, good. And so, therefore, in chapters 1 through 5, what is coming? Judgment is coming. That's right. But even though judgment is coming, there are glimmers of hope. And those two themes of glimmers of hope are in the what of the Lord. That was what we talked about last week. What was that?
Is it the ark? Silence?
No, not the ark of the Lord. The day of the Lord. Yes, and we talked about how Isaiah can use the term day of the Lord to refer to this punishment coming or to refer to the ultimate day of the Lord. And in fact, he can even use it to refer to the day of the Lord is going to happen to Babylon and to Assyria for what they did to the Jews. So one way to think of it is as a mountain range. If you're looking at it head on, it looks like one big thing, but if you're looking at it from the side, it's like foothills to the ultimate day. So if Isaiah is standing here, or the reader, it kind of all merges, but you have the lowercase day of the Lord, lowercase day of the Lord. There could be lots of those, and then the ultimate day of the Lord with a capital D in the end. And so we talked about how even in your own life you can, because you know the ultimate day of the Lord is coming, you know judgment is coming and all things will be made right, you can look at oppressive things in your life, if someone is unfair to you at work or something like that, and say, you know what, that's bad, but judgment is coming. And whether I have to wait to the end of history for that, all things to be made right, or even maybe in this situation. And you see that theme played out in all kinds of books and stories and movies, right? The bad guy gets what they deserve in the end. And the reason that resonates with us so well is because that is the true story of humanity. She just changed it.
I just changed it.
Okay. That resonates with us so well because that's the story of humanity. That's the human story, is that we live in a world that's not right, but everything will be made right in the end. Okay.
What's the blank with Jerusalem?
The New Jerusalem. And that's going to be the topic for today. That's another one of the glimmers of hope throughout. Now, there's more than 2 mentions of it, but we're going to look at 2 of the main mentions of it after we get through this review. Okay, then chapter 6. Isaiah sees blank Yahweh. The blank there is king. He's on his throne, King Yahweh.
Do you guys remember the image of chapter 6? Do you want to briefly just...
Yeah, 6 wings, cover their eyes.
Yeah, the vision.
Yeah. So, in this vision of seeing God, God's what makes Isaiah realize his own uncleanness. God's holiness. Good. And then what does God do to Isaiah with fire? Yes. And that is a new concept. Up until now, fire was never a purifying thing in the Old Testament. You would burn the sacrifice, but it wasn't the fire that purified you, it was what you sacrificed to God. And the fire was the means by which you could do that. So this was a new concept that is introduced here in Isaiah, and it becomes a big theme, a purifying fire. Like similar to refining gold, he uses that image, I think, in the end of chapter 1. Then the Lord sends him, Isaiah, to proclaim to the nations the impending destruction. Is that blank? So chapter 6 is a big deal. There's a lot of key things. But even in that destruction, there's a little glimmer of hope, symbolized by what metaphor? A remnant, yes, but there's a metaphorical picture of a remnant.
Tree coming out of the stump.
The stump, yeah, just the stump. You cut down the tree, you burn it. And if you've ever tried to burn out a stump in your yard, you know that you burn it, it's still there a little bit. You burn it, yeah, you burn it 100 times and there's still a little something there. Okay. And that, it says the holy seed is the stump in the land. And I think there's that means 2 things. And there's a lot of disagreement on this, but it is the people who've been purified, but it's also a holy seed that's going to end up being the Messiah, which is going to be a huge theme developed in this. I think it's referring to both. But there's other people who would think it was just one or the other. Okay, and then 7 through 12, Ahaz chooses to trust who instead of King Yahweh? The king of Assyria's world empire instead of Almighty God's world rule. Remember that name? Tiglath-Pileser III, and we call him TP3. Yes. Yeah, he's a big deal.
It's crazy that 3 people got that name.
Yeah, well, they were really big into, like in France, Louis XIV.
Maybe you to say that.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so under that section, 7 through 12, chapter 8 is about the coming of Assyria to destroy Judah. Never confuse Assyria with Syria. Assyria is an empire over in Mesopotamia. So Assyria. Coming of Assyria to destroy Judah. And that's the day of the Lord. This was Isaiah uses the concept of day of the Lord because typically the Jews were like, yes, the day of the Lord, all our enemies will be put down and we'll be raised up and that's going to be great. But he says, actually, the day of the Lord's going to come upon you too. So he takes that concept and sort of turns it against those who are corrupt and oppressive in Jerusalem and Judah. And then chapter 9, the coming of a new David. Now, they probably would have thought at that time a new descendant of David, but we'll talk about later today how it's a new David. And then chapter 10, the coming destruction of Assyria. So God uses Assyria to destroy Judah, and then he uses, not Jerusalem, but the north and the nation of Judah, everything except Jerusalem. But then he destroys them. They were just a rod in his hand. Chapter 11, the coming of a new Jerusalem. And when we hear the images of the New Jerusalem and the lion, or the wolf laying down with the lamb and all those kinds of images, we think of the world peace, which is the case, but also world domination. It's hard for us in modern America to think about defeating our enemies as a good thing, but that was definitely how the ancient world felt. And then lastly, that huge section, 13 through 27, judgment on who? What is that section about? Lynn, you read some of those chapters.
Yeah, it was judgment on a whole bunch of different
A whole bunch of
cities
different
and
nations. Yeah, judgment on the nations. And we'll have plenty of time to dive into that section next week. Okay. So that's the review.
Can you go
So
over the time period while we're reviewing or do it?
I kind of did.
Oh, okay.
What heading could we give to this entire section? In other words, what does it all have in common? If you're looking over that. Good. Judgment is an element. I think judgment's a subcategory of something else, but it's definitely part of it. It's a difficult question. I just want to give you a chance to think about it.
The Israel people being punished.
Yes, good. It's like a sentence. Uh-huh. Excellent.
I think there's still something that brings all those things together.
Yeah. And
They
that
all come from one.
that is kingship. A king in the ancient world was also the judge. We've divided those in America for good reason, because kings are sinful, but this king is not on his throne. He's perfect. He's the perfect judge, and people rebelled against him, and he sends judgment and punishment. And you see all these images of kings. For example, God is the king, and God also, in this book, he keeps, it's a little bit confusing. He's the king, but he's also going to send a king. And obviously, we know, now that we know the New Testament, we understand that a lot. It's a lot clearer to us why that's one and the same, because the Father and the Son are one and the same. But it goes back and forth between he's the king and he's going to send a king. In contrast to Uzziah, in contrast to Ahaz, in contrast to Tiglath-Pileser III, TP3. You think, Ahaz, that because he's the king of the world, this world empire, that he's going to save you? You're wrong. He's going to destroy you, and then I'm going to destroy him. He's just an instrument in my hand. So you got to remember, in ancient times, the king was more than just the head of state. He was the judge, means he would settle disputes and doling out sentences of punishment. He was the general. He would devise every strategy. You think, in this case, think like Hitler. He was the head of state, but he also considered himself a military genius. Yeah. And he would lead every battle personally. We would never do that with our head of state here. And he would rally the troops. It was a big morale boost to see your king out there in the battlefield with you. So he was the judge, he was the general, he was the lawgiver, he was the treasurer. We separate all those things in America. We were supposed to separate the lawgivers from the presidency, but we don't do that very well. But anyway, so he would be in his capital city, and he would send out laws to all the other cities that he rules over, and he would collect the wealth of his kingdom there in the capital city. So the royal city is super important in an ancient nation, and it's hard for us to understand. The ancient world functioned much more like a city-state world. Like, we learned about that probably when we learned about Greece, Athens and Sparta and all those city-states. But we think of in terms of nations. So like in America, we're like, so this is America or whatever, and this is the nation of Canada. Everything in here is that, everything in here is that. And this is the nation of Mexico. Everything in there. But it wasn't like that to them. They were more like, here is my kingdom. I've got Jerusalem, and I've got this other city, and this other city, and this other city, and this other city. This is the capital city. And then, of course, all the farmland in between. Hello? Okay. Can you just leave it there?
Thank you, Christine.
Okay. Sorry. I couldn't just leave the package. Okay. So, the farmland just functioned as a means of feeding the people in the city. So the farmland was not, I mean, it was necessary, but it wasn't really, none of the culture was there, none of the craftsmen were there, none of the artists, none of the scribes. So you went to your nearest city if you wanted something from a blacksmith or a leather worker or a shoemaker, or if you wanted to hear something read from a piece of literature, if you wanted to, anything you did in your culture happened at your local city. The rest of your life, if you were just out in the country, it was just farming. And then every harvest, you would bring your stuff and you sell it to feed all those people and get what you needed. even your religion, everything happened in the city. So our concept of borders wasn't really their concept of borders. So think about it like this. Of course, because we have cars, we have to, it would be better if this was all on a smaller scale. Florida was like miniaturized and you could walk to Orlando in a day or two. But let's just think of it like that. So we're all in the farmland that feeds Orlando, right? And we're all terrified that Tampa might invade. There's this other city. So, but if that happens, we all go to Orlando inside the city walls. And we go to Orlando for our religious services. That's where the temple is. We go to Orlando for everything. Our life out here is just doing the farming. That's it. Now, let's say Orlando gets more and more powerful and they take over Tampa. And now all this wealth and taxation and produce and manpower, because you can conscript men into your army from there, now that you control that city. Suddenly your army's bigger, everything's bigger, and like, maybe we could take over Jacksonville. And so that's how these empires would build. All, really it's one city controlling a whole empire of these other cities, plus their surrounding farmland just to feed those people.
But the farmers didn't fight. They weren't in the army, right?
No, not really. There was different policies, but yeah, different nations had different policies about that. But often they didn't have like a professional military, but they would, months out of the year they'd be on campaigns, and then for the winter they'd go back to their homes wherever and do whatever they did. Yeah, but for the most part, yeah, the people were not involved. They didn't have any kind of armor, which was very important. If you're in a battle where people are swinging blades, the armor was expensive. Okay, so if you think of it in...
Did you already move on to these?
Yeah, I did. If you think about it in terms of the importance of the capital city of these kingdoms of cities, you can see how they thought about it like, instead of thinking about it like border, they thought about it like, this is my city and I can take over that city and this city and I can take over this city and this city. And I'm building this empire of cities. That's what Tiglath-Pileser III was doing. And that's, what David did. And he passed that on to his son Solomon. Think about those empires. Nineveh was one city that controlled the whole known world. At one point, they conquered Egypt, which is the other superpower. Babylon, same thing. Rome was a city that ended up taking over the whole world, from Britain to, the Middle East. And then, of course, once they had that, then there was the whole power issue, and they ended up moving the capital to Constantinople later. But the point is, that was how the ancient world functioned on a city level. So that concept of a royal city controlling everything is a super important concept. And in the biblical story, ultimately, Jerusalem is going to be that one city that rules the whole world. And the law goes out from there, and everything comes to it. Except not wealth, people, and honor. I'm just going to, before we move on, I'm going to say one last thing about this. And that is that the city was not really the part of the original plan. Who founded the first city in the Bible? Cain founded the first city. Nimrod also was a city builder, but before him, Cain founded the first city. The first murderer founded the first city. Yeah. It's the picture of every city. And then you get Babel. All the roots of the city are evil. And we still see that today. There's more crime in cities. Not just more crime per person, per capita in cities. But God, the cities are a human institution. It wasn't instituted by God, but God redeemed that. And now he uses a city as his means of the new creation. I mean, think about the Apostle Paul, right? Where did he go? He went to the cities to spread Christianity. It's the same thing with a king. God had never planned for Israel to have a king. But once they got a king, then he's like, okay, well, we're going to use this then, and you're going to get David, and then from that's going to come the great king. So God redeems, turns our bad choices into good things. Okay, so let's look at the New Jerusalem. We've got two passages, chapter 2 and chapter 11. Now, chapter 2, verses 2 through 4 is this poem that opens a section, a large section. And so, Katie, could you read this poem of 2 verses 2 through 4?
In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore.
Okay, before we start talking about it, does anyone have any questions about that little poem? It's quite a powerful image.
Takes place in the future.
Yes, the last days.
Right now.
Not right now, yeah. We definitely don't have all people. We definitely don't have all peoples streaming up to Mount Zion. And Mount Zion is definitely not the highest mountain in the world. Let's talk about that. The mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. In ancient times, people thought of mountains as the home of gods, the gods, or their god. There's references in the Bible and in other ancient literature to Baal having a certain mountain, Mount Zaphon, and different things like that. And Zion is the mountain, which is a piddly mountain in comparison, that God has chosen, where God has chosen to reside as his home. Now, it's unfortunate that NIV translates that word temple there, the mountain of the Lord's temple. It's actually the word house. And you can understand their thinking, the house of the Lord is the temple. That's true. But there is a separate word for temple, and this is the normal word for house. What version do you have there then?
The New American Standard.
What does it say for the mountain of the Lord's?
2:4.
2:2.
The mountain of the house of the Lord.
Yeah. Okay, so the New American Standard is a more wooden, literal, word-for-word translation. It doesn't flow as nicely. But, yeah, so that's a more accurate one there. And the significance is not much, because it is talking about the temple, but the important thing is God's going to live there among his people. And that's going to be the highest of mountains. Now, whether Mount Zion will literally have a higher elevation than any other mountain on earth, maybe so, maybe not. That's not really the point. The point is God is going to be greater than all those other gods who don't exist. So he automatically is. But it's going to become clear. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. So right there you see universal acknowledgement that Yahweh is the supreme God, really the only God. So in this poetic image of Mount Zion being the highest point on earth, Isaiah uses irony by using another metaphor, stream, right? The people are not going to literally flow the way a stream flows. They're going to walk, right? But he uses that as a metaphor. They're going to stream to it, like a stream flowing. A stream flowing to the highest point on earth. Streams don't flow up. So by using that incongruous metaphor, you have a mental image that he's painting of the highest point on earth and people streaming up to it, flowing like water up to it. The point that he's making is something is drawing him there. Some kind of divine magnetism, something. And not that it's not voluntary, not that it's against their will, as you were going to see in verse 3. But before we move to verse 3, all nations stream to Zion. What does that remind you of? Is when he says all nations, is Isaiah referencing some older scripture, do you think?
Probably Egypt and other countries that were powerful back then.
Yeah, all these other nations. And a specific passage, though, can you think of one? And
Genesis already promises through Abraham all nations will be blessed. Is that what you got?
yes, yes. So a reference to Abraham, all the nations. The Jews many times lost sight of the fact that God had chosen them to be a light to the nations, not just chosen them to be better than the nations. That they got that wrong many different times. I'm not saying every single one of them, but And Isaiah is saying, all nations, these promises to Abraham are going to be true. They are going to happen in the last days. Okay, verse 3. Can you read verse 3?
Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem."
Any thoughts or questions about verse 3? There's something.
Yeah, in the passage, the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem is one of those Hebrew parallels that we talked about the other day.
Yeah, definitely. I think the law, if you think of it in terms of Torah, is definitely the word of the Lord. And Zion is definitely parallel with Jerusalem. Pretty much synonymous.
Kind of like it's the headquarters for all law, giving, understanding, judgment.
Yeah,
So he's not talking about two different things here, it's only one thing with two references to it. The law and the word are the same in Zion and Jerusalem are the same as you just said, right?
yeah, I think so.
Well,
But also law giving in the civil sense will happen too, as you can see from verse 4.
If you take the word Torah, go back up and he will teach us his way.
Yeah,
Torah and teach are essentially the same.
Yeah.
Instruction.
that's right.
So he's talking here about instructing people, not necessarily announcing laws as we would normally think of.
Right.
So Torah has a different conception than is often given.
Yes. Yeah.
when
Go
it
ahead.
says many peoples at the beginning of verse 3,
Uh-huh.
is that referring to the all nations right before it? So if you think about all these like people that are not necessarily Israelites, they're all coming and they're all like acknowledging, I mean, I'm sure they all had different gods previously, but they're all acknowledging the one, the God of Jacob.
Yeah, that's, I think, the surprising part about this verse, especially from an ancient mentality when it was assumed, like, now, we know now that racism is wrong, but in the ancient world, it was equated with patriotism, right? Like, of course you think your race is the best. You'd be unpatriotic if you didn't. The difference being, at that time, a people group was also essentially all related to each other. Yes, so we've started to differentiate some things. Okay, it's good to be patriotic, but it's not good to like look down on someone because of who their ancestors are. But back then, it was just assumed and expected that everyone thought their race was the best and their God was the most powerful. Well, you'd be a fool to not worship your own God. And yet you have all these other nations coming and saying, hey, let's go up to Zion and to the mountain of Jacob, and he can teach us his ways. We can learn to walk in his ways. We can learn about his instruction and his word.
But it's in the last days. It's at the end of the chalkboard there.
Yes.
They've had plenty of time to learn the foolishness and foolhardiness which will come in chapter 11. Their own ways and their own gods and their own idols.
Yes.
But that's not going to happen until the last days. At least according to
That's right. Yes. It should have happened had the Jewish people obeyed and kept their part of the covenant. They would have been a kingdom of priests, and they would have been blessed, and people would have said, wow, I want to go to that God, because that God, he's a lot better than our God. Mm-hmm. And you did have people coming and, what do you call that? I guess defecting to the Jewish people. You have, for example, Naaman the Syrian. And he went back and he took like a wagon full of dirt with him, of Israeli dirt. And he was like, I'm gonna worship on this. And then everybody who comes by is like, why do you have this little pile of dirt? And you're like, well, this is from Israel. They have a real God there. So you did have examples of that, of people coming, but not the way it could have been. But it will happen in the end. And then in verse 4 you have the civil law stuff. He's going to judge between the nations and settle disputes for many peoples. So now you have not just a reference of universal acknowledgement of Yahweh's godhood, but now also universal rule under him as the king. And then, if you could read the rest of verse 4 here, Kate.
They will beat their all verse 4?
Yeah, well, just this bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore.
What does that make you think of?
Wasn't that the 1,000-year reign where there's no war, God's ruling? He doesn't allow it.
It's definitely an eschatological time period. Of course, again, when Isaiah wrote this and when people read this, they weren't thinking, oh yeah, just after the 7-year tribulation, then this, they're just like, that's going to happen, ultimately. What?
This had to be very confusing.
Yeah, but once again, remember the mountain view, they're looking at it head on, right? And it all blended together into one thing. And even the ultimate day of the Lord is going to be separated out into judging different things. And there's going to be a separate judgment for Christians, the Bema Seat, and then the Great White Throne Judgment. There's going to be all kinds of things, but that's not the point here. The point is, this is going to happen, ultimately, in the great day of the Lord.
He was standing in the spot where it was going to happen. Where the temple was.
Yes. But let's look back the other way. Does this make you feel, does this emotionally remind you of anything in previous, before Isaiah?
Isn't this what they felt when they finally got into the promised land?
When they finally got into the promised land.
After they got rid of, well, they never got rid of all of them.
They never
They
did.
got rid of a lot. Then they started turning away from war.
Yeah, they were supposed to get rid of the Canaanites. They ended up essentially turning into Canaanites.
Yeah.
If you read Judges. But I don't think they thought of all nations. But I think that passage is reminiscent of Eden, in a sense, because it's not just the fact that, well, okay, we're all part of the same country now, so I guess there's nobody to go to war against because we all have one king. It wasn't like that. The instruments of war are turned into instruments of what? Harvesting fruit. That's a pruning hook, right? And a plowshare. And the instruments of war and the reasons for war are the fact that we have this nation against this nation and conflict essentially over land and power. And then they won't train for war. There's not a mentality of war anymore. It's very much an Edenic image.
So the religion of Islam must disappear then.
It must disappear.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
that's the driving force.
Yeah, all peoples are going to come to Zion to learn the God of Jacob, and people who don't like that, and there are people now who don't like that, well, they're not going to like it, but they're going to do it. They're going to do it, I guess, or the ones who don't like it won't be left. But the point here is, this is the ideal world with Jerusalem as its capital. So that's the poem. It's a beautiful poem. why is it here in the book of Isaiah when he's been saying, you're all sinners, you're all going to be destroyed, judgment's coming, and I'm going to preach, but you're not going to listen? Why is it here? What effect would this poem have had on Isaiah's original audience? What?
Give them hope.
Yeah, exactly. It's this sin and doom kind of lesson, and then right in the middle there's this little 4-verse poem, or 3-verse poem. It's hope. Yeah, it is going to be destruction and all that, but someday, in the end, Jerusalem's going to be the capital of the whole world. And everyone's going to come, and it's going to be a beautiful time of Edenic peace, and prosperity, and harmony, and worship of God, and God teaching.
And you probably thought that day coming, Jesus showed up. He's going to be the king, rescue them from the Romans.
Yeah. Once again, when the Messiah finally came, they again, that's what we do. When we read a passage, we're like, okay, so this is all one thing, but God's like, well, actually, teases it out. Well, actually, this is separate from this, is separate from this. So that's why I try not to come down real hard and fast on those eschatological timetables, because it may be that when you've seen those charts from studying Revelation, it may be that something we think of as an event is teased out in more layers. I don't know. I'm just saying it's hard when you're looking at it head on. Things blur together. Okay. So yeah, this would have been there for purposes of hope in a very depressing book, if you were reading at that time. And the fact that if you're reading this and you're like, oh no, we totally blew it. We were supposed to be that kind of nation. We weren't. We totally blew it. Look, oh yeah, you're right, Isaiah. There are very few people who are saying this. But you're right, Isaiah. We do deserve what's coming to us. We totally broke our covenant. And then this is here. But God is still going to keep his promises to Abraham. Remember when he made the promises to Abraham? Abraham fell asleep and God walked through alone, meaning, I'm going to keep this. It's not dependent on you, Abraham. Okay, so that's the purposes of the poem, but Isaiah also uses this poem. Look at verse 5. Come, descendants of Jacob, let's walk in the light of the Lord. Now, that's the same word as up in verse 3. All the people are going to say, come, let's go to the mountain of the Lord. And he says, come, not the nations, descendants of Jacob. Let us walk in the light of the Lord. In other words, if we're going to be the kind of people that's going to be a light to the world, we better walk in the light of the world. To make a very loose parallel, if you're going to tell people to get saved and join the church, you should have a church worth coming to. Not full of gossip and pettiness. But full of love for each other. Okay, but then starting in verse 6, that's the ideal Jerusalem that's going to happen someday, but what's actual Jerusalem like? Can you read? Now, I have made an ellipse of some verses there, but just to get the general effect of the rest of the chapter.
You, Lord, have abandoned your people, the descendants of Jacob. They are full of superstitions from the east. They practice divination like the Philistines and embrace pagan customs. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled.
So, actual Jerusalem, they became pagans, so God abandoned them. And this creates a problem, right? He just said this is going to happen, but God abandoned them. And so the day of the Lord in verse 12, that that partially solves the problem. But since none are righteous, the full answer, there's a clue to that in chapter 6 with the purifying, just a clue, and then that concept of God is going to purify out a special remnant for himself of pure people, that gets fully unpacked in chapters 40 through 55. There's just a little hint of it in chapter 6 with that little coal image. And how that actually happens gets totally unpacked later in the book. Okay, let's look at chapter 11. Now, as my lovely wife reads this chapter, two things to be looking for while we read it, and you can mark it up. They've got a new page starting here. Look for connections with the little poem we just read, because this is another New Jerusalem section. So look for any connections, and look for new information that's added. There's going to be, so those little 3 verses gave a little blip. This is going to happen someday. And then here is a whole chapter about this, and so you get a lot of extra information. So if you think of it like Isaiah's painting, and he just says, okay, someday you're going to have this new, that's supposed to be a city skyline, okay? And then throughout the course of the book, he keeps ratcheting it up and saying, well, and look, and there's going to be this, and this is going to be, this building is going to have these things, and it's going to be like this, and the people are going to come like this. He keeps adding more information. So by the end of the book, you have a more robust understanding of this New Jerusalem thing. So look for connections and added information. The whole thing.
A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and the little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, and their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the 4 quarters of the earth. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, nor Judah hostile toward Ephraim. They will swoop down on the slopes of Philistia to the west. Together they will plunder the peoples to the east. They will subdue Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites will be subject to them. There will be a highway for the remnant of his people that is left from Assyria, as there was for Israel when they came up from Egypt.
Okay, so did anyone make any connections?
Yeah, the new heaven and earth is like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, it is. It teases that out more. Okay, not just that there's no war, but that there's no hostility between predator and prey.
They won't need the implements of war that they
Right. They won't need those.
That ties in with chapter 2.
Yeah. They won't need rat poison or anything to kill a snake. They won't need a fence because no wolves will come and steal their sheep.
He gave a little more detail about how he's going to judge the nations.
Good, yeah. Can you explain that a little bit?
He's going to not do it with what he sees or hears, but with righteousness and justice.
Yeah, good. What do you think that means, not do it with what he sees or hears?
Because he knows men's hearts, not just the outward.
Yes. He sees right to the... Proverbs is the glory of a king to search out a matter, right? Get to the bottom of it. And the ultimate king gets to the bottom of it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was Solomon's way of being able to see the hearts of those two women.
I guess there was bad blood between these nations, and that all heals up. Ephraim and Judah.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Because before we're like, no more war and everything's going to be great and they're all going to be on the same team. And it's like, they will swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines and they will plunder the people to the east and subject these other peoples. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought war was... it's hard for us to see God as a warrior, the way the Bible depicts him.
What would Philistia be today?
What would... Well, the Palestinians claim to be descendants of the
And
Philistines.
what would be the nations of the east, of this east?
I don't... You're saying the descendants of them? I mean, I don't know. Philistia
immediately to...
Well, that's what they say. I don't know if they really are descendants of them. They claim that.
They are,
Well,
and the ones to the east are who? Today it's the Middle East.
Well,
What was,
sure.
Assyria, Babylonia, Acadia, Sumer, all of which is now modern day Iran and Iraq and partly Syria. The whole Arabian Peninsula.
Well,
That was all part of the original grant to Israel. It was all the way over to the Tigris,
Yeah.
Euphrates River, and all the way over to the Great Sea in the west. They're going to get back what was promised to them.
yeah, they're going to get back the whole world. The king in Jerusalem is going to rule the whole world. You're right. I think the point here is not the bad blood between certain nations. The point here is that when the true David comes, the Messiah comes, he's going to, back up in verse 4, strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. So that is what allows this Edenic existence. It's tempting to see those as incongruous, but actually God's judgment is at the same time good for some and bad for others. Right? I mean, that's what the day of the Lord is. Remember last week we went through, is this the day of the Lord? Is this positive or negative? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Depends whose point of view you're looking at. The day of the Lord is great for some and terrible for others. And then let's real quick look at that Messiah. In verse 1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. This is very important. There's the stump, right? This is the ground. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. He's going to be filled with the Spirit of the Lord, right? And then on the next page, verse 10, what does it say about that Jesse and the stump?
Yeah, Dan.
Well, what word does it use regarding Jesse? Is it a shoot? Is it a twig? It's the root. So the root, and you know the root of the tree, right, goes down a little deep under the ground. So if this is Jesse, who was David's father, and there's going to be a shoot coming out of him, it's going to be the Messiah. But the Messiah is also the root. Well, I mean, there's a lot of scientific stuff ancient people didn't understand, but they understood that the root supports the tree. They knew that. Right? So if you're talking about an ancestor or a descendant, is this Messiah an ancestor of Jesse or a descendant of Jesse? I mean, the shoot would say a descendant, the root would say an ancestor. How can he be both? I think everybody knows. I think you all know the answer is that Jesus Christ is physically a descendant of David, but he's also God, so he is the originator, the creator of David and Jesse. Another important key is that this is the only reference to Jesse. None of the other kings that came from David's line were ever called a son of Jesse. They were called sons of David. Never called sons of Jesse. The only person ever called a son of Jesse was David himself. So this isn't just a new king in the line, a new member of the dynasty. This is a new David. And that concept is all throughout the Psalms, that David, that we're waiting for a greater David. So all those Davidic Psalms become Messianic Psalms. We don't have time to unpack that though. Okay, look at verse 9. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Right? Now, trees cover the face of the ground, right? You look at mountains in the distance and they're in the fall, if you're up north, not down here, but in the fall you see the whole mountain is like orange. And later, right? Or green. But there's gaps in between. You actually go on that mountain, you're going to find places where you can stand and look straight up and see sky. Right? Okay? If you go to the bottom of the ocean, there's no place where you can look up and see straight to the sky without seeing water. Right? It's an image of complete knowledge of the Lord. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. There's no gaps. There's no person who's like, I didn't know. I was just doing my own thing. It's ratcheted up from chapter 2, verse 3. And these images keep getting ratcheted up over the course of the book. They're going to come and they're going to be taught, right? Okay, so everyone from every nation is going to come and get taught by God. I mean, it's the same concept, but it's much more fulfilled here. It's much more complete. There's going to be no lack of knowledge of God.
Kind of indicates that Satan, who's in charge of the world today, won't be here, won't be in charge of the world.
Won't be deceiving people, yes.
Won't be the prince of the earth. He's obviously gone.
Yes.
He blocks knowledge of the Lord. Pulls the veil over people's eyes.
Yes.
And in this day, that's gone.
That's a good point. Yes. Let's see. Verse 11. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time and reclaim the surviving remnant of his people. Why do you think it says a second time? There's two really good guesses. One of them I think is right.
Because the first one was when they were conquered by Assyria, and then the second one that's reversed.
He's going to reach out his hand and reclaim his people.
Yeah, so
The first one would happen where? Where would it be in here? I'll move my hand and you say stop. When I
Up. No, she'll make two.
Here?
No,
Here?
Back up.
Here.
the first red down.
Assyria.
Yeah.
That's Babylon there, Assyria.
But was any when Assyria ended, was anyone reclaimed from another place?
I don't know.
So the first
When Babylon took over Assyria, the people that were enslaved by Assyria just stayed. In Babylon, they just got a new master. Nobody was reclaimed until they returned. Okay.
So that's the first reaching out of his hand?
Well, that's one view. I actually don't think that's right, but that is a view.
Is it Jesus, the first hand, and then the second time,
So let's just finish this one. Okay, so maybe when God lets them come back from the land, he reclaims them from the places they were in captivity and lets them come back. That's one. And then two is in the end when he gathers them up from all over the world. The other view is that the first one goes back to the Exodus. And that's more, actually more of the scholars think that one. Because there's a lot of Exodus language in there with his hand and reclaiming them and reference to Egypt, 2 different references to Egypt there. And then look in verse 16. He's going to bring them back from Assyria as there was when they came up from Egypt. So lots of references back to the Exodus. And we're over time, so we have to end with this. A lot of the imagery of Isaiah comes out of images from the Exodus story. And the point is, he's saying to the people, he's the same God. The God who rescued his people against all odds. Okay, there's a group of slaves, refugees, and they're up against an ocean of water and an army coming. They're unarmed. They don't have any weapons. It spells certain destruction, right? And God parts the ocean, parts the sea. The same God who did that is the same God who's going to bring you back from this. It's the same God who's going to, at the end, bring all his people back together. That's why Isaiah is so confusing, because he's putting all these images together. It happened then, it happens now, it'll happen after the exile, it'll happen ultimately in the end. He's the same God, the God who rescues. Close in prayer.
God, thank you so much for this time. We can come and study your word, review your promises. God, we want to trust you and trust your plan for the redemption of the world. Just wait for you to come and to do your most righteous judgment on the world. And I pray that you would help us to live out our lives in view of that. Help us to honor you with everything that we say and do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.